In the spring of 1919, an entire city played jazz music through the night, not in celebration but in terror. They played to survive. They played because a letter had arrived demanding it, and the author of that letter had been ending lives in the darkness for nearly a decade. This is a true story. We're on a journey to reach 100 subscribers, and every single one of you matters in building this community of truth seekers. If you're drawn to the shadows, where history hides its darkest secrets, this is your invitation. Before we descend into this case, I want to know something. Leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from. New York, London, Tokyo, São Paulo? I want to understand just how far these stories travel. How many corners of the world are touched by the same fascination with the unexplainable? Drop your location below, right now, and let's see where in the world the Midnight File reaches tonight. Now, if you appreciate the work that goes into bringing these forgotten cases back to light, I'm asking for something simple. 20 likes on this video, just 20. It tells the algorithm that this matters, that these stories deserve to be heard. And while you're down there, hit subscribe, because what you're about to hear is only the beginning. There are more files, more mysteries, more nights that will keep you awake with questions you can't answer. Subscribe now and you won't miss a single one. Let's open the file. Every city has its shadows. But New Orleans, the Crescent City, has always worn its darkness differently. It's a place where history doesn't just fade, it lingers, it breathes. It watches from the corners of gas-lit streets and listens from behind the closed doors of shotgun houses. And in 1918, something emerged from those shadows, something that would terrorize a community, baffle investigators, and vanish as mysteriously as it had arrived, leaving behind only bodies, broken families, and a single theatrical letter that would become legend. They called it the Axeman. But before we can understand the terror that gripped New Orleans between 1918 and 1919, we need to understand the world these victims inhabited. We need to see the city as they saw it, to feel what they felt when they closed their eyes at night, wondering if tonight would be the night the chisel scraped against their door. Picture New Orleans at the turn of the 20th century, the air thick with humidity and the scent of magnolias, the streets alive with the sound of languages blending together, Italian and French and English creating a symphony of immigrant dreams. Beginning in the 1880s, over 300,000 Italian immigrants, many from Sicily, fled their homeland and arrived in Louisiana. They were searching for something America had always promised: opportunity, dignity, a chance to build something with their own hands. Many of these families established themselves as grocers, small business owners who became the backbone of their community. The area between Jackson Square and Esplanade Avenue transformed into what locals called Little Palermo, a thriving enclave where the smell of fresh bread and cured meats drifted through narrow streets, where neighbors spoke the old language and remembered the old country. But America, for all its promises, rarely delivers them without demanding payment first. And for Italian immigrants in the early 20th century, that payment came in the form of suspicion, discrimination, and violence. These industrious families, who asked for nothing more than the opportunity to work, were stereotyped as culturally backward, as racially suspect. Between 1886 and 1910, nearly 30 Italian men were taken from their homes and their businesses by vigilante mobs and lynched. 30 human beings, guilty of nothing more than speaking with an accent and succeeding where others had failed. This wasn't ancient history. This was the world into which the Axeman would emerge, a world where Italian-American families already lived in fear, already understood that the system designed to protect them might fail them when they needed it most. Keep that context in your mind, because when we talk about the investigation into these attacks, when we discuss the failures of law enforcement and the wrongful convictions that followed, we need to remember that this community was already vulnerable, already marginalized, already conditioned to expect the worst from those sworn to serve and protect. Now let's talk about what happened in the darkness. The story most people know about the Axeman begins in 1918, but historian Miriam Davis, whose meticulous research has become the definitive account of these crimes, presents compelling evidence that the terror actually began years earlier. Between August 1910 and June 1911, a series of attacks occurred in New Orleans, targeting Italian grocers with a brutality and methodology that would later become horrifyingly familiar. At the time, newspapers called the perpetrator the Cleaver. August 13th, 1910, 3 o'clock in the morning. That hour when darkness feels most complete, when even the sounds of the city seem to hold their breath. Harriet Crutty, 29 years old, opened her eyes to find a figure standing over her bed, a shadowy male form, and in his hand, catching whatever dim light filtered through the window, a meat cleaver. Imagine that moment, the confusion, the terror that must have flooded through her as her mind struggled to make sense of what she was seeing. Was this real? Was she still dreaming? And then she looked down and saw her husband, August, lying unconscious on the floor, already bleeding from where the blade had found him. They survived that night. They handed over $8 to their attacker, and he left them alive. $8. The price of their lives. But it didn't stop. Other Italian grocers were targeted in similar attacks over the following months. The pattern was consistent and disturbing. The attacker would enter homes by chiseling out door panels, a technique requiring patience and a certain dark craftsmanship. He would assault his victims with blunt instruments, and critically, nothing was stolen. No money, no valuables, no goods from the stores. Whatever this person wanted, it wasn't material wealth. On June 27, 1911, the attacks escalated. Joe Davis became the first fatality, struck down in his own home, in his own bed, by someone who had taken the time to carefully remove a section of his door and step inside. And then, as mysteriously as the attacks had begun, they stopped. For 7 years the Cleaver vanished. Perhaps he died. Perhaps he was imprisoned for some other crime. Or perhaps he was simply waiting, refining his method, preparing for a return that would be even more terrible than what had come before. May 23rd, 1918. The Axeman's reign truly began on this night, though no one yet knew to call it that. Joseph Maggio, an Italian grocer, lived with his wife Catherine in an apartment above their grocery and saloon at the corner of Upper Line and Magnolia Streets. It was a modest life, the kind built on long hours and careful savings, the kind that promised security if you worked hard enough and kept your head down. But security is an illusion. We tell ourselves we're safe when we lock our doors and turn out the lights. We tell ourselves that violence is something that happens to other people, in other places, in other circumstances. Joseph and Catherine Maggio believed they were safe. They were wrong. In the dead of night, while the couple slept, someone removed a panel from their back door. Not broke it, not smashed through with force, but carefully, methodically chiseled it away. The intruder stepped inside, carrying tools and intent in equal measure. What happened next I need to describe carefully. The attack was savage beyond what most of us can truly comprehend. The assailant cut both victims' throats with a straight razor, then took an axe, one found right there in the residence, and used it to inflict wounds to their heads. Catherine's injuries were so severe that her head was nearly severed from her body, nearly decapitated in her own bed, in her own home, while the city slept around her. Joseph's brother, Andrew, discovered them approximately 2 hours after the attack. Joseph was still barely clinging to consciousness, still fighting against what had been done to him, but within minutes, he was gone. Catherine had already passed. The crime scene told a story if only investigators could read it properly. The perpetrator had actually changed his clothes before leaving, abandoning his blood-soaked garments and donning clean ones. A bloody straight razor was found in a neighbor's yard, and it was traced back to Andrew Maggio's barber shop. That detail, that single piece of evidence, should have been a clue. Instead, it became a weapon pointed at an innocent man. Andrew was arrested, suspected of taking his own brother's life. The reasoning was simple and tragic in its flawed logic. The razor was his, he was close to the scene, and the police needed someone to blame. Andrew Maggio was eventually released, but only after enduring the horror of being accused of such an unthinkable crime. What the police refused to see, or couldn't understand, was that robbery had clearly been ruled out. Nothing was taken. Not the money from the store, not Catherine's jewelry, not anything of value. This wasn't about theft. This was about something else, something darker, something that didn't fit into the neat categories of crime that law enforcement was trained to recognize. If you're still watching, If this case is pulling you in the way it pulled me in when I first opened this file, then do something for me. Share this video. Send it to someone who appreciates true crime, who understands that these stories aren't entertainment, they're history, they're truth, they're the voices of victims demanding to be remembered. Share it now and let's ensure these names are never forgotten. 1 month later, on June 27, 1918, the pattern continued. Louis Bisuma, another Italian grocer, and his mistress, Harriet Lowe, were attacked in Bisuma's store on the corner of Dorgenois and La Harpe streets. The assailant struck Bisuma in the right temple with an axe, fracturing his skull so severely that his brain was damaged. Lowe was struck above her right ear. Bisuma survived, though survival is perhaps too gentle a word for what he experienced. His injuries were catastrophic, life-altering in ways that would haunt him for whatever time he had left. And then, in a twist that seems almost absurd in its cruelty, he was arrested and charged with being a German spy. This was 1918, remember. The First World War was raging, and paranoia about enemy agents had infected American society like a disease. An Italian grocer with a fractured skull becomes a suspected German spy. The logic is absent, but the prejudice is clear. Harriet Lowe initially survived her injuries, but she would die months later due to surgical complications. Before her death, in a state of delirium likely caused by her wounds and the trauma of what had been done to her, she accused Bisuma of being her attacker. A dying woman's confused accusation against the man who had been lying beside her when the real attacker struck. The case grew more complicated, more confused, more impossible to solve with each passing day. August 5th, 1918. Anna Schneider, 28 years old and 8 months pregnant, woke to find a dark figure standing over her bed. She was nearly beaten to death with a lamp, not an axe this time, suggesting either a variation in the attacker's method or possibly a different perpetrator altogether. But both Anna and her unborn child survived miraculously. She could provide no description of her attacker, nothing that would help investigators narrow their search. 5 days later, on August 10th, Joseph Romano, an elderly man, was attacked in his bedroom while he slept. His nieces, Pauline and Mary Bruno, who lived nearby, heard the commotion and rushed to help. They caught a brief glimpse of someone fleeing, but their descriptions were vague, useless in any practical sense. A bloody axe was discovered in the backyard. Chisel marks on the back door confirmed what everyone was beginning to understand. This was the same person, the same method, the same inexplicable violence. Romano died 2 days later from his injuries. After Romano's passing, police finally acknowledged what the community already knew. A serial attacker was loose in New Orleans, targeting Italian families, grocers specifically, entering their homes through chiseled door panels and inflicting terrible violence with whatever weapon was at hand. But acknowledging the pattern and stopping it were two very different things. Between the Maggio and Bisuma attacks, someone left a message. It was chalked on a nearby fence, crude but deliberate. It read, "Mrs. Maggio is going to sit up tonight, just like Mrs. Tony. Mrs. Tony Chiambra, a victim of the Cleaver attacks over 7 years earlier." This message suggested that either the Cleaver and the Axeman were the same person, or someone was deliberately trying to connect the two crime sprees to create the appearance of a continuing threat. Was it the attacker himself, proud of his work, eager to claim credit for past violence? Or was it someone else, someone with knowledge of the old crimes, someone playing a cruel game with a terrified community? We'll never know. If you've made it this far into this story, if you're still with me in the darkness, then I know you understand why these cases matter. Hit that like button if you haven't already. We're aiming for 20 likes on this video, a small goal, but one that means everything in terms of reaching more people who care about truth and history. And if you haven't subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? There are more files to open, more stories that need to be told. Subscribe now and become part of this community. The violence continued into 1919, and with it came something unprecedented in American criminal history, a letter. But before we discuss that letter, we need to understand one more attack, one that would lead to a profound miscarriage of justice. March 9, 1919. Across the Mississippi River in Gretna, Louisiana, the Axeman extended his territory. Charles Cortimiglia, his wife Rosie, and their 2-year-old daughter Mary were sleeping when the attacker entered their home. All three suffered severe head wounds from an axe. Little Mary, the youngest known victim of these attacks, did not survive. A 2-year-old child. I want you to think about that. Not a grocer who might have been involved in some business dispute, not an adult who might have angered the wrong person, but a child who had barely begun to understand the world, whose only crime was being born into a family that someone had decided to target. Gretna police, perhaps unwilling to believe that the New Orleans attacker would cross into their jurisdiction, focused their investigation on the Cortimiglia's neighbors, the Giordano family. The Giordanos were also grocers, and there had been recent tension between the families over business competition. Orlando Giordano, 68 years old, and his 17-year-old son Frank were arrested. Rosie Cortimiglia, traumatized, confused, possibly suffering from her own head injuries, identified the Giordanos as her attackers. Despite the implausibility of this identification, despite the absence of any credible evidence, both men were convicted. Frank Giordano, a teenager, was sentenced to death. His father received a life sentence. Think about that for a moment. A 17-year-old boy, sentenced to die for something he didn't do. An elderly father watching his son condemned, knowing they were both innocent but powerless against a system that had already decided their guilt. The Giordanos would eventually be exonerated, becoming one of the earliest significant wrongful conviction cases in American legal history. But that exoneration came only after years of unjust imprisonment, years stolen from their lives, years they would never get back. Frank Giordano lost his youth in a cell, waiting to be executed for a crime he didn't commit. This is what happens when prejudice infects an investigation. This is what happens when law enforcement is more interested in closing a case than solving it. Now, let's talk about the letter. March 13th, 1919. Amidst the height of public panic, amidst a city gripped by fear and confusion, the New Orleans Times-Picayune newspaper received an extraordinary communication. The newspaper published it 2 days later, on March 15th. The letter was dated simply, Hell, March 13th, 1919. It was addressed to the editor of the Times-Picayune and began with the greeting, Esteemed mortal. Already you can sense the theatrical nature of what's to come. This isn't a typical criminal communication. This is performance. This is someone who understands the power of words, of drama, of creating a persona. The writer declared, They have never caught me, and they never will. They have never seen me, for I am invisible, even as the ether which surrounds your earth. I am not a human being, but a spirit and a fell demon from hottest hell. The letter continued in this grandiose style, claiming that the writer had been roaming over the city, searching for prey. But then came the truly extraordinary part, the demand that would make this letter legendary. The writer announced his intention to strike again on March 19th, 1919, at precisely 12:15 in the morning. But there was a caveat, a condition that seemed to come from some fever dream. If everyone has a jazz band going, the letter stated, so much the better for you people. If not, I shall pay your city a visit and find out if you have any jazz in your souls. The threat was explicit. Those who do not jazz it out on that particular night will get the axe. An entire city, ordered to play jazz music to avoid being targeted by a serial attacker. It sounds absurd, like something from a dark comedy rather than a true crime case. But for the people of New Orleans in March 1919, there was nothing funny about it. The question that has haunted historians and criminologists ever since is simple. Was this letter authentic? Did it truly come from the person responsible for the attacks, or was it a hoax, a publicity stunt, or something else entirely? Historian Miriam Davis has presented compelling evidence that the letter may have been written by local jazz musician Joseph John DeVilla as a promotional tool. DeVilla released a song titled The Mysterious Axeman's Jazz, Don't Scare Me Papa, on the exact same day the letter was published. That timing seems too convenient to be coincidental. Furthermore, Davis's research into contemporary newspaper accounts and archival evidence reveals that the popular narrative, the story of an entire city playing jazz throughout the night of March 19th, is largely myth. Most people ignored the letter. The threatened night passed without incident. The attacker did not strike. Dance halls were not universally packed. Most homes did not host musical gatherings. But the myth persisted, amplified by later historians who prioritized dramatic storytelling over factual accuracy. The truth, as it so often does, got lost beneath layers of legend. However, whether the letter was authentic or not, its impact was real. Mass hysteria swept through New Orleans. Some dance halls did feature live jazz performances that night. Some private homes did gather musicians and play through the darkness. And the letter itself became an iconic piece of American criminal history, predating the Zodiac's taunting communications by decades. It became the image that defined the case in popular memory, even if that image was built on a foundation of fiction rather than fact. As the violence continued through 1919, the investigation remained frustratingly stalled. On September 3rd, Sarah Laumann, a 19-year-old woman living alone, woke to find an intruder attacking her with a blunt object. She was knocked unconscious, sustaining severe head injuries and losing several teeth. Neighbors discovered her bloodied on her bed and called for help. A bloody axe was found on the front lawn. Laumann recovered but retained no memory of the attack, no description of her attacker, nothing that could help investigators. October 27, 1919. Mike Pepitone, an Italian grocer, was struck repeatedly on the head by an axe while sleeping beside his wife, Esther. Mike died from his injuries. Esther survived. This would be recognized as the Axeman's final canonical victim, though some historians dispute whether Pepitone's demise was truly part of the series or a separate vendetta. And then the attack stopped. Completely suddenly, without explanation, the Axeman vanished. For a city that had lived in terror for over a year, the silence should have brought relief. But how do you celebrate when the threat hasn't been caught, hasn't been identified, hasn't been stopped, but has simply chosen to stop? How do you sleep peacefully, knowing that the person responsible for so much death and suffering is still out there somewhere, unknown and untouchable? The investigation had been a disaster from the beginning. Multiple suspects were arrested, interrogated and released. Andrew Maggio, Luis Bezemer, various Italian immigrants falsely identified by traumatized survivors, the innocent Giordano family, none of them were the Axeman. Law enforcement seemed more interested in finding someone to blame than in actually solving the crimes. The investigation was hampered by incompetence, by underfunding, by xenophobia that contaminated every aspect of the process, by the technological limitations of an era before modern forensic science. But perhaps most significantly, some historians suggest the investigation may have been deliberately sabotaged or misdirected by organized crime elements who had their own reasons for wanting these crimes to remain unsolved. So who was the Axeman? Over a century later, we still don't have a definitive answer. But there are theories, each with its own evidence, each with its own problems. The most popular suspect is Joseph Mumfre, a career criminal with a history of extortion and organized crime. Mumfre was connected to a blackmailing gang that specifically targeted Italian Americans. His criminal record was extensive. His reputation for violence well established. The circumstantial evidence linking Mumfre to the attacks is intriguing. He was incarcerated during certain periods when the attacks allegedly did not occur. He was free during the 1918 to 1919 surge, and his name appeared in connection with an earlier case involving the Siambras, victims of the Cleaver attacks, where a suspect named Mumfre was mentioned. But the most compelling event connecting Mumfre to the case occurred on December 2, 1920, over a year after the last attack. In Los Angeles, a woman dressed entirely in black, heavily veiled, stepped out from a building doorway and shot Joseph Mumfre to death on a public street. The woman made no attempt to flee. She was arrested immediately. Initially claiming her name was Esther Albano, she later revealed herself as Esther Pepitone, widow of Mike Pepitone, the Axeman's last victim. She claimed that Mumfre had entered her bedroom the night Mike was taken from her, that she had recognized him fleeing her home. She further alleged that Mumfre had also ended the life of her first husband. New Orleans police learned of the shooting and immediately incorporated it into their investigation, viewing Mumfre's demise as potentially definitive proof of his identity as the Axeman. For a police department desperate to close the case, this seemed like a gift. The widow had taken justice into her own hands. The Axeman was no more. Case closed. But Miriam Davis, through her comprehensive historical research, demonstrates conclusively that this narrative is deeply flawed. The timing of Esther Pepitone's revelation, over a year after her husband was taken from her, strains credibility. Why wait? If she knew who was responsible, why not come forward immediately? There is no documented contemporary evidence linking Mumfre to any of the earlier attacks. The physical evidence from the crime scenes, descriptions of the attacker as a young, athletic man, is inconsistent with Mumfre's profile and age. The Mumfre theory appears to be largely the product of wishful thinking, a police department's desire to declare the case solved even without conclusive proof, a widow's need for someone to blame, and perhaps the taking of a life in vengeance that had nothing to do with the Axeman at all. Another theory suggests the crimes were orchestrated by members of the Black Hand, an early form of organized crime that emerged in Italian-American communities. The Black Hand engaged in extortion, targeting grocers and small business owners with threatening letters. If their demands went unmet, violence followed. According to this theory, the Axeman may have been an enforcer carrying out sanctioned violence against those who refused to pay protection money. The fact that victims were primarily grocers and that nothing was stolen from the crime scenes supports this interpretation. Why rob when you're sending a message? Why take valuables when the point is terror? Some researchers have pointed to a figure named Frank Doc Mumfre, a professional pharmacist who allegedly worked as a deadly member of the Black Hand. Mumfre was rumored to have been involved in attacks on grocers and business owners between 1910 and 1915. But definitive evidence linking the Black Hand to the Axeman crimes remains absent. While the economic targeting pattern and the lack of theft suggest organized crime involvement, no documentation, no informant testimony, no forensic evidence has conclusively proven this theory. A third theory posits that the Axeman was a lone serial attacker driven by psychological pathology, perhaps a combination of severe misogyny, sadistic tendencies, and a compulsion to inflict harm. The theatrical nature of the letter, the selection of victims, the ritualistic elements, removing a panel, changing clothes, leaving the weapon behind, are consistent with the behavior of documented serial offenders. Under this theory, the attacker's motivation may have been related to xenophobia and racial antipathy toward Italians, or it may have been entirely personal and unrelated to the victim's ethnicity or occupation. Some criminologists, including Colin and Damon Wilson, have suggested the Axeman was a sexual sadist motivated by gratification derived from violence. But no surviving victims reported certain types of assault, and contemporary police records are too fragmentary to confirm or deny this theory. A fourth possibility is that the Axeman was not a single individual at all, but rather a name applied to multiple perpetrators committing similar crimes over an extended period. Given the inconsistencies in attack methods, victim profiles, and the geographic spread of attributed crimes over more than a decade, this theory has merit. Perhaps some of the earliest Cleaver attacks were unrelated crimes later conflated into a single narrative. Perhaps some offenses attributed to the Axeman were simple robberies gone wrong, crimes of passion, or organized crime violence that sensationalizing newspapers labeled as Axeman crimes to sell papers. We don't know. And that uncertainty, that absence of closure, is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this entire case. Some evidence suggests the Axeman may have continued his activities beyond New Orleans. According to police reports documented by researcher Davis, similar attacks occurred in other Louisiana locations through 1920 and 1921. Joseph Sparrow and his daughter in Alexandria in December 1920. Giovanni Orlando in De Ridder in January 1921. Frank Scalisi in Lake Charles in April 1921. These crimes were never officially confirmed to be connected to the New Orleans Axeman, but the similarities in method and victim selection are striking. If these crimes were indeed the work of the same person, it suggests the attacker either relocated to evade law enforcement or that the New Orleans police and media simply failed to recognize that the violence had continued outside their jurisdiction. Before I bring this to a close, I want to take a moment. If this story has affected you, if you've stayed with me through this entire investigation, then I need you to do something. Leave a comment. Tell me your thoughts. Tell me which theory you find most compelling. Tell me whether you think the letter was authentic or a hoax. Engage with this community, because that's what we're building here, a community of people who believe that truth matters, that history matters, that victims deserve to be remembered. And subscribe, please. We're trying to reach 100 subscribers, and every single subscription tells me that this work is worthwhile, that these stories need to be told. Subscribe now and be part of something that matters. The legacy of the Axeman extends far beyond the immediate terror he inflicted. The case illuminates the intersection of multiple American historical currents, the xenophobic treatment of Italian immigrants who came to this country seeking opportunity and found discrimination and violence instead, the primitive state of criminal investigation in the early 20th century when forensic science was in its infancy and law enforcement relied on prejudice and assumption rather than evidence, the power of media sensationalism to shape public understanding of crime, creating myths that persist long after the truth has been forgotten, and the vulnerability of marginalized communities to both criminal violence and police misconduct. Perhaps the most tragic legacy is the wrongful conviction of innocent people. Frank Giordano, sentenced to die for a crime he didn't commit. His father, Orlando, given a life sentence for the same fabricated crime. Louis Besuma, accused of being a German spy and his own attacker. These men suffered not because of what they did, but because of what they represented to a justice system infected with prejudice and desperation. The Giordano case became one of the earliest and most significant exonerations in American legal history, but that exoneration came too late to undo the damage, too late to restore the years stolen from them. The Axeman has experienced a cultural renaissance in recent decades. The television series American Horror Story, Coven, featured the Axeman as a supernatural character in 2013, introducing the case to millions of viewers who had never heard of it. Books, graphic novels, academic research, and scholarly articles have all explored the case from different angles. Rick Geary's graphic novel, The Terrible Axeman of New Orleans, and Ray Celestine's novel, The Axeman Jazz, have brought the case to contemporary audiences. But it is Miriam C. Davis's meticulously researched book, The Axeman of New Orleans, The True Story, that has fundamentally reshaped historical understanding of these crimes. Davis challenged long-standing myths, presented new evidence, and demanded that we look at this case with fresh eyes, with intellectual honesty, with a commitment to truth over legend. Her work reminds us that popular history is often inaccurate history, that the stories we think we know are frequently built on foundations of fiction rather than fact. The city playing jazz throughout the night of March 19th. Largely myth, Joseph Mumfre as the definitively identified Axeman, unsupported by evidence. The attacks beginning in 1918, actually preceded by similar violence in 1910 and 1911. These corrections matter, not because they diminish the case, but because they honor the victims by insisting on truth. So what happened to the Axeman? Multiple theories exist regarding his fate. Perhaps he died either from natural causes or through criminal retaliation. Perhaps he was incarcerated for unrelated crimes during the 1920s, effectively ending his violent spree. Perhaps he intentionally ceased his attacks, either satisfied with what he had done or frightened into retirement by the intensity of law enforcement scrutiny, however ineffective that scrutiny ultimately proved. No conclusive evidence supports any of these theories. The question of his ultimate fate remains unanswered, just like nearly everything else about this case. Over 105 years have passed since the first documented attack on Joseph and Catherine Maggio. The serial attacker's true identity remains unknown. No arrest was ever made. No confession was ever obtained. No forensic analysis, impossible in the era in which these crimes occurred, ever definitively identified the perpetrator. What is known with certainty is that between 1910 and 1921, someone, or perhaps multiple someones, targeted Italian immigrants and Italian Americans in Louisiana with particular brutality. These victims were denied justice. Their families were denied closure. The investigation was compromised by corruption, xenophobia, and incompetence. Innocent men were convicted and imprisoned, and the person responsible vanished, leaving behind only blood, unanswered questions, and an iconic letter demanding jazz. The Axeman of New Orleans remains one of America's most fascinating unsolved cases, a dark chapter in the nation's criminal history that illuminates both the horrors of violent crime and the grave consequences of prejudice in the criminal justice system. I think about those nights in 1918 and 1919. I think about Italian grocers lying awake, listening to every sound outside their doors, wondering if tonight would be the night the chisel scraped against wood, the night the panel fell away, the night the axe came down. I think about children like Mary Cortimiglia, too young to understand the danger, too innocent to deserve what happened. I think about Frank Giordano, 17 years old, waiting in a cell to be executed for something he didn't do. And I think about the person responsible, whoever he was, wherever he went, however his story ended. Did he ever feel remorse? Did he ever look back on what he had done and recognize the magnitude of suffering he had caused? Or did he die believing he had gotten away with it, that his crimes would never be solved, that history would never identify him? We'll never know his name, we'll never see his face, we'll never understand his motivations with certainty. And perhaps that's the most unsettling truth of all. Not every mystery has a solution, not every case gets closed, not every file gets stamped with the word solved in red ink. The Axeman of New Orleans walked into the darkness over a century ago, and the darkness kept him. His identity, his fate, and his ultimate story remain his secrets alone. Every town keeps a secret. Some just bury it deeper than others. And in New Orleans, beneath the jazz music and the celebration, beneath the centuries of history and culture, there lies a file that was never closed, a case that was never solved, a name that was never revealed. If stories like this stay with you, if they haunt your thoughts the way they haunt mine, then subscribe to the Midnight File. Because there are more cases waiting to be opened, more victims waiting to be remembered, more truths waiting to be uncovered, and the next file, the next story, might be the one that keeps you awake tonight. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring. Thank you for being part of this journey into history's darkest corners. The file is closed for now, but there are always more to open. Until next time, I'm Julian Cross, and I'll see you in the Midnight Hour.